is a town meeting. We're hoping to, jumpstart our work for the new year. And of course, tonight we are aware that it is the day to remember the death of Martin Luther King Jr. and all the work that he did for justice. So we're going to begin with a prayer, remembering our call to God for justice and the work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And so let us pray. From Psalm 82. God stands in the divine assembly. In the midst of the gods gives judgment. How long will you judge unjustly and favor the cause of the wicked? Do justice for the weak and the orphan. Give justice to the poor and afflicted. Rescue the needy and the weak. Set them free from the hand of the wicked. They neither know nor understand. They walk about in darkness, and all the earth's foundations are shaken. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for all the nations are yours. And so we pray, righteous God, you render justice for the poor and the afflicted. In trust we pray. Help us to transform Dr. King's life and words into actions that asserts equality for everyone. Give everlasting peace to those who have given their lives for justice and the protection of human rights. May God strengthen and inspire us to make real the gospel vision of universal and inclusive love and salvation. Through God, the God of peace. Amen. And so with those words, knowing that we're all here because we are people hoping to promote justice in so many different ways, but tonight this group is specifically focused on immigration justice, and we have Joanna Gardner with us, who is going to be our speaker tonight. So I'd like to say a couple words about Joanna as we begin. Phyllis, would you like to do that?
I would love to do that. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I'm on a phone and on a computer, and I'm hoping this works. But let me say that it is my privilege and pleasure to welcome Joanna tonight. We are so happy she can be with us and kick off our new year and our new program. And as you know, Joanna will be talking about immigration law and how it has changed over the last century or so, and what we are looking at today in terms of our immigration situation, and also a little bit about her work and her practice representing victims of domestic violence and trafficking and obtaining humanitarian visas for them. Let me tell you a little bit about Joanna. She is a lifelong Catholic who grew up in South Jersey, attended St. Rose of Lima and Christ the King Parish. After college, she spent a year in Honduras, volunteering with a home for abused, abandoned, and neglected children called Amigos de Jesus. Her experiences in Honduras led her to pursue a law degree and become an immigration lawyer. She graduated from Rutgers Law School in 2019 and began working at the nonprofit HIAS Pennsylvania, where she is currently a staff attorney on their domestic violence initiative. Her practice focuses on the humanitarian visas available to immigrant survivors of domestic violence, human trafficking, and sexual assault. So with that, I'll give the floor to Joanna, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really such a privilege to be here with all of you tonight. I can't thank you enough for the invitation, and I love speaking to groups about immigration law, and so I'm really excited to present to you all tonight, if I can figure out how to do it. All right. Hopefully everyone's going to be able to see my screen.
Mhm.
And also, hopefully the translation is working correctly. And if at any point we need to pause, or if I'm talking too fast for the interpreter, please just let me know. I've got my eye on the chat box. And so or just interrupt me. That's fine also.
Joanna,
All right, so
can you give an announcement one last time? Because we did have a few people start since translation was set up.
sure. Just wanted to make sure that translation is working. And if I'm speaking too fast for the interpreter, just send a message to the chat box or interrupt me, and I will go slower. And I just want to make sure that everyone who's looking to get translation, there is a translation option. Si necesita esta presentación en español, haz clic ahora en el botón en su pantalla, hay un círculo. Y si haz clic en ese botón, puede hacer la traducción de inglés a español. Okay, so I'm gonna get started, but yeah, please interrupt me if there's technical difficulties. So thanks for the very kind introduction, Phyllis. Yes, my name is Joanna Gardner. I work at HIAS Pennsylvania as an immigration lawyer. Zoom, it can be frustrating, but it also, I think, presents some unique opportunities. So very highly encouraged to put your questions into the chat box. Unless I'm talking too fast, try to keep yourselves on mute so it doesn't get too confusing. And but I do encourage you to put your questions into the chat box constantly throughout the presentation. So what I'm going to be talking about tonight is first a presentation that I designed called Immigration Then and Now, which I really designed in mind for an audience that might be asking themselves why immigration might look different for people today than it did for our ancestors, or for certain ancestors. And I was excited to hear in the presentation folks talking about their ancestors who were immigrants. So what the presentation is going to be about is I'm going to talk about my great-grandfather who came to the United States from Italy. And by telling his story, I'm hoping to show how the different immigration laws then, when he came to the United States around the turn of the century, 1800s into the 1900s, looks really different if he, that same person, would be trying to come into the United States today. So that presentation is going to take up most of our time tonight. And then Phyllis said that you were interested in some current events. So I pulled a few current events from immigration law that have been on my mind and that that you've probably heard about and are interested in. And so I'm going to go through some of those. And then at the end, there'll be time for Q&A. As Phyllis mentioned, my practice is very specialized on the humanitarian visas available to survivors of domestic violence and other types of crime. I'm not going to talk too much about that tonight. It could be its own presentation. But if you do have questions about that and my work, I do welcome them during the Q&A at the end. So let's jump in. These are some harsh questions I have up on the screen, but I think people ask them often from a place of honesty. Folks that might not have had their immigration experience recently. I often hear this phrase from folks like me, who look like me, who are white, who their ancestors came to this country maybe 100 years ago, or we trace our lineage to our grandparents or our great parents, as to why aren't immigrants coming legally today? And I want to take that question and try to answer it in a way that I think can help people think a little bit differently about how much harder it is to come legally today than it might have been for our ancestors. So those are the questions we're going to look at tonight. So to do that, and I promise I will get into the story of my great-great-grandfather, I'm going to give a quick crash course in immigration law, the history of immigration law. And basically, I'm going to divide our immigration laws in the United States into two phases, phase 1 and phase 2. So phase 1 takes us all the way up to 1924. So the very first immigration law ever to be on the books in the United States did not pass until 1882. So for the first 100 years of our history as a country, we didn't really have immigration laws the way we think about them today. It just didn't exist. This idea of who's allowed in and who's allowed out, that didn't come to be in our minds until 1882 with, unfortunately, the Chinese Exclusion Act, a pretty shameful moment in US history where, arising out of anxiety about the number of Chinese immigrants coming into the US, the government passed a law saying no more Chinese people are allowed into the country. Pretty terrible idea that we could exclude an entire people, but that's what happened. That didn't get repealed until 1942. And then the second immigration law that passed in that year was the Immigration Act of 1882. And it was a pretty basic law, but it basically said we can exclude from the country folks who are convicts, lunatics, likely to become a public charge. So for a second, we need to step back into 1882 and think about what it meant to be a migrant in 1882. It mostly meant getting on a ship, on a boat, and coming into the United States, arriving at a port of entry, and maybe you had a brief interaction with an official, and then you were waved on through. And so there wasn't this idea that you needed to show up with papers. Papers weren't really part of the way we thought about immigration at this time. It was more if you arrived and you weren't a convict or a lunatic, as they used that word in that time, or likely to become a public charge, which meant likely to rely on charity or not be able to work to support yourself, you were waved on through, and you weren't considered sort of a separate part of the society or, a second tier of the society. You were allowed to fully participate. A major exception to that, of course, being enslaved people, which had been brought here against their will. And that's kind of another aspect of immigration to this country in those years. But focusing on, for a moment, the immigration laws that would have applied to immigrants coming of their own free will, this is what it looked like for them. So that takes us, there's a few other things that happened. I'm going to gloss over and do it kind of quick. That's the way it looked like all the way up until 1921 and 1924, where we see big changes. And the first one is in 1921, which sort of as an emergency power during World War I, the United States is starting to feel really, really anxious about all of the immigrants that are coming in. Big waves of migrants had come from Ireland, from Germany, from Italy, from Russia in the years from 1850 up until the 1920s. And people are really feeling a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment. And the government responds with a major cut to immigration called the Emergency Quota Law. And then that gets codified or sealed into law in 1924. And so 1924 ends this first phase of immigration laws, because what we get in 1924 is the first ever cap on all immigration. And we get what's known as a national origin quota. So they set that quota at 2% of the nationality from the 1890 census. So a lot of Italians came in 1890. We have a lot of Russians and Eastern Europeans. And so this law hit them really hard, because even though 2% seems like it's neutral, it really had the biggest impact on the largest groups of people that had been coming in the recent years. And then the other big change is that it's no longer the case that you arrive at the shores of the United States, you pass sort of a basic exam and you get waved on through. Now, for the first time, starting in 1924, you have to start applying for your visa overseas and arriving at our border with that piece of paper in your hand. And that's so up until 1924, there was no such thing as a visa. For the first over 150 years of our history, or about 150 years, no such thing as a visa. Very limited immigration laws on the books, and 1924 brings an end to that. So before we hop into phase 2, I want to show a graphic that I really love. This is a beautiful chart created by Natalia Bronstein. And this shows raw numbers of immigrants coming into the United States over time and where they come from, right? So when I talk about immigration then and immigration now, so waves of immigrants, if you can see, I don't know if you can see my mouse on your screen. Oh, you good, you can. So starting in 1830 until the 1840s and 50s, we see a big chunk of folks coming from Ireland. That's this dark green swath. And I know a lot of the Catholics who look like me in the group are going to be able to trace their ancestors back to 1850, 1860, 1870, when all the Irish people are coming and they're fleeing potato famine, they're fleeing starvation and poverty. We also have large groups of, large groups of immigrants coming from Germany. And those waves of immigrants from Germany continue all the way through, let me see if I can, there we go. Those waves of immigrants from Germany continue all the way up until the 1900s. We get a lot of German folks. And then even as the Irish are tapering off, we start to see people from my ancestors' home country, Italy. So Italy starts being the major sending country, or one of the major sending countries, right around here in the 1900s. And also Austria-Hungary, we see a big dip, and that's no accident because this is World War I. So World War I, so these folks are refugees fleeing political violence and war from Austria-Hungary. Before there was a refugee system, folks were able to just travel to the United States and pass through a port of entry like Ellis Island. Up here we have Russia. So these countries are becoming now, so you see how one wave of immigration ends from a European country to be replaced by another wave, and each one kind of meeting with different kinds of hostility until they too are sort of absorbed into the fabric of America. And then we see this major decline in constriction right around the time in the 1920s when the United States enacted our first big immigration restrictive law. The 1924 quotas, we put a cap on immigration, you start applying for your visas overseas. But that's not the only reason immigration falls off so much at this time. It's also the Great Depression. So the Great Depression is a time when people just really aren't moving. America's not doing so well. People don't want to come here. Okay, so then we move into the next phase. So now not only are our laws different, but the folks who are coming from different places. And that's where this graph really gets so beautiful, because here we see this large swath up here, a brand new color from Mexico. Here, immigrants from Mexico start becoming a larger and larger portion of the immigrants that are coming to the United States, really growing through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. The pink strip is the Caribbean and other Americas. The orange strip is South America, and the purple is Central America. And then down here at the bottom, we have all other Asian countries in this section here, India in gold, China here, and then other European countries. And so these numbers reflect numbers of green cards, as we would call them today. So folks that are coming lawfully and with immigration status. And so this chart here doesn't reflect large numbers of unauthorized immigrants that come into the country during this time. But what it does reflect is, so over here, right? Everyone that came was authorized because there was no such thing as a green card. There was no such thing as a visa. And they're coming in numbers that are actually not all that different from the numbers of folks who are coming as authorized immigrants today. They're just coming from different places. And I think it shows a real solidarity between where we can really see in a graph the wave of immigrants that brought my ancestors and the wave of immigrants that are bringing folks today. Okay, so that said, let's jump into the modern day. And this is sort of phase 2. So we left in 1924, and 1924 saw you had to start applying for a visa overseas for the first time. So everything changed. And we had caps on the numbers of immigrants that were allowed in. So a lot of restriction. And a lot of things happened between 1924 and 1986, but I want to jump in at 1986 because this is where we really get to modern day immigration law and the modern day policies that we deal with now, because 1986 was the Immigration Reform and Control Act, IRCA, which was the first time that we see kind of a criminalization of immigration. And this was, again, in response to anxieties people were feeling about the numbers of immigrants. Particularly at this point, we were seeing a rise in undocumented workers coming from Mexico and South America. And so there was a concern about the southern border that we hear about all the time in our debates today. And so 1986 said, we're going to massively increase border patrol and penalties for employers and penalties for immigrants. However, at the same time, they provided the first amnesty. And the fascinating thing about 1986 is that this was a law passed by a Republican president, Ronald Reagan, and it's the first known and only time that mass amnesty was granted to many people living undocumented in the United States. So by 1986, we already have a large population of undocumented folks, about 3 million people. And so even though the government cracked down on immigration in 1986 and cracked down on border security, at the same time, very practically recognized that there was a need to do something for all of the folks who are already here working and running the economy, much like, you know, the ancestors who had come from Ireland and Germany and Italy had done. And about 3 million people were able to get green cards through that amnesty. And, you know, it's interesting that it was done under a Republican president. And then we have 1996, 10 years later, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, or IRA. It's a mouthful. And this is the immigration law that we have today. Our immigration law dates back to 1996. IRA, you know, it's going on now. Oh, math is hard for me, but it's 25 years old, just about, a little bit older, and we haven't had meaningful overhaul of the system ever since then. And 1996 did a lot of things to really restrict immigration. There was a big emphasis on criminalization. This law was passed under President Bill Clinton right around the same time as a lot of the tough on drugs and tough on crime bills were being passed. It limited the power of immigration judges to make individual determinations in some cases. So certain convictions would come with automatic deportation, including drug convictions, and a judge wouldn't really have a lot of power to look at everything else about that person. And we're still living with this law today, and it increased barriers for asylum seekers. So we're actually going to dive in a little bit more to what the current immigration laws look like in a minute, but I've given you a lot of history. I just want to step back for a quick minute and think about this graph. So let's just look at the blue line for a minute. So this blue line, again, kind of illustrates the story that I've just been telling about our immigration laws. It starts here around 1850, and you see just a steady increase of immigrants all through 1850, all the way up into the 1920s, right? And then it falls after the restrictive immigration laws that were passed and the Great Depression. Then, starting around the mid-1960s, it starts shooting up again with immigrants from South America, Mexico, Central America, and many Asian countries, mostly. And this trend line shows not just lawful immigration, it also shows folks who are coming into the country undocumented. So this is all immigration, right? Including folks coming without authorization. So it's a really big increase. And I think folks that are against immigration will often say, look at how many more immigrants there are. There's so many people coming in now. It wasn't like that when my ancestors came. But this line doesn't give us enough context, because what we really need to look at is this orange line, because the orange line tells the story. The orange line shows immigrants as a percentage of the total population. And what you can see is that as a percentage of the US population, some of the highest moments for immigration in our country were this very time between 1850 and 1920, when we were seeing massive waves of immigration from Ireland and then Germany and then Italy and then Russia, right? We're seeing 15%, and it's holding steady at a very high level of the total population. And we needed folks, right? We were doing Western expansion. There was industrialization. Folks were coming in and helping to build the country. And then it falls, it falls, it falls. And then again, towards the 1960s, it rises. But as a total percentage of population, it's never gotten as high as the peaks that it was when my ancestors came here. So relative to the size of our country, immigration is actually quite low and has been for many decades. And as someone like me would argue, far too low for the needs of the country today, considering things like our falling birth rate in the United States and the need for many workers, in industries that are not able to be filled. And so when folks talk about immigration, I think it's important to keep these two trend lines in mind, particularly as we think about what immigration looked like then and what immigration looks like today. All right, so I promised a story. And so I want you to meet my family. Actually, let me quickly look at the chat box and make sure there's no questions. Okay, good. So this is my family. My great-grandfather, Enrico Matera, is the one sitting third from left. Very handsome crew, nice mustache. This is the ship's manifest from the boat that my great-grandfather arrived to the US on. And his name is all the way here at the very bottom. And it's got just wonderful information. If you haven't looked up your ancestors, if your ancestors came to the United States up until about 1924 or before 1924, you really should go to Ellis Island's website and check it out and find some information about your family. But based on this information and information from my family, I've put together sort of a case profile for Enrico, the way I might for an immigration case that I take now. So his name was Enrico Matera. He entered the United States through Ellis Island on January 20th, 1903. He was 16 years old, and he came with his younger sister, Marcella, who was 14 at the time. Both of his parents had died, and so today, he would be known as an unaccompanied minor or an unaccompanied alien child. And he came from Italy. The ship's manifest says he has no arrival documents. Remember, there was no such thing as a visa back then. His only family ties in the US were his two older brothers. He had no employment prospects. He didn't know an employer. The ship's manifest says that he arrived with $12 in his pocket. His occupation is listed as peasant. He has no mental or physical illness. He's never been in prison or an almshouse or supported by charity. And he's not a polygamist, which is actually important. All right, so that's Enrico, right? So let's think about his case like an immigration lawyer in 1903 when he came to the United States. What laws would have governed whether or not Enrico Matera could come into the United States in 1903? Oh, this is the ship that they entered in. That's on the website too. Okay, so there was the Chinese Exclusion Act, barring, straight up barring all Chinese people until 1942. There was the Immigration Act of 1882, which excluded convicts, lunatics, those likely to become a public charge. I didn't mention 1885 or 1887, the alien contract labor laws. This was a really interesting set of laws. Actually, in the wake of the Civil War, there was a flurry of activity to try to replace the labor that had been previously done by enslaved people with other essentially free labor. And there were a lot of unscrupulous contractors that would bring people over, pay for their passage in exchange for their free labor. That was very quickly outlawed. But if there was any hint that you might be in a contract labor situation, you would be excluded from the US. You wouldn't be allowed to be admitted. But Enrico didn't have anything like that. There's the Immigration Act of 1891 that I also didn't talk about much, but it basically just expanded the list of criteria that you'd get examined for. So you're excluding felons, polygamists, that's why that's important, and those suffering from infectious diseases. So that's why immigrants that are applying for green cards today still go through a physical exam. And that started back here in 1891. But according to the ship's manifest, Enrico is in very good health. There's not yet any country quotas that would have limited Italians to 2% of the 1890 census. And there's no requirement that he come with a visa or any kind of papers. So what do we think? Is Enrico going to be allowed into the United States? In the chat box? Where I can't see too many of you, but you folks think that this is going to work out for Enrico? I'm seeing some nods. Yes, you are correct. Enrico gets to come into the United States. All right, so that was then. What about now? What if Enrico Matera was trying to come into the United States today? Oh yeah, there's a lot of yeses. Everybody did a really good job. You're all correct. All right. So before we can answer this question, the 1996 law that we have today creates several categories for folks, and it's important for us to quickly understand what each of those categories are. So everybody that's in the United States falls into one of these 4 categories that you see up on your screen. If you have a temporary visa, you're what's known as a non-immigrant, which might sound funny, but that's because you're not here permanently. You're here for a temporary stay, a student visa, right? It's going to expire when you're done being a student and you'll have to go home. A tourist visa, the limited amount of time that you're allowed to be here. You're not allowed to work while you're here. So limited stays, and there's a lot of rules that apply to what you can do. Whereas an immigrant visa is just one thing. A lawful permanent resident or a green card or an immigrant visa, all of these things mean the same thing. And so someone that wants to come into the United States, work, establish a life here and stay permanently, what they want is, they don't want a student visa or a tourist visa, they want a green card. They want something that's going to let them stay permanently. You can't just come in as a citizen. You must start with a green card. So you start by getting your green card, and then if you've gotten that approved, most people need to wait for 5 years with their green card before they can apply for citizenship. So the ways to be a US citizen, there's just a few ways. You're either born in the United States. Everyone born in the US has birthright citizenship. It's there in our Constitution. Or you naturalize, and naturalization is the name for that process of going from having a green card to a citizen. Or there's acquisition and derivation, which are processes where, for instance, someone who's born abroad, but your parents are citizens, you could still get citizenship. So everyone else who is in the United States who's not a citizen or a green card holder or with a valid, unexpired, non-immigrant visa is considered undocumented. And that can be folks that had a valid visa and overstayed their visa. It can be folks that entered the US without inspection, across a border. It can be people with DACA, unfortunately. DACA provides protection from deportation and the ability to get a work permit, but it doesn't yet provide folks with an actual green card or the ability to stay permanently, which is what we really need and what folks really want. It's what Enrico wants. Enrico wants to come here and establish himself and start a new life with his family. So that's for us to keep in mind. And so you can't just go from having a student visa and pay a fee and have it turn into a green card. There's a certain very limited ways to get that green card, which is what you want if you're going to come here permanently and be able to work. There are really only 4 pathways to getting a green card. There's family sponsorship, which is by far the most common way. There's employment sponsorship. There's the visa lottery, which is exactly what it sounds like. And there's a whole umbrella kind of package of humanitarian pathways to get a green card. So these are the 4 options. So let's see if Enrico qualifies for any of these ways to come into the United States legally today, start a life, work, and live here indefinitely, just like he did back in 1903. We'll start with family. So in order to be sponsored for a green card, there's the family pathway. A US citizen can sponsor their spouse, their children, their parents, or their siblings. For their parents, the US citizen child must be over 21. So if a parent comes here and has a child who's born here, they can't petition for their undocumented parent until they would turn 21, or their parent overseas until they turn 21. Green card holders or lawful permanent residents, they can petition for their spouses and children who are unmarried. All right, so Enrico has a sibling here. So we don't know if Enrico's siblings were citizens when he came, but let's assume for the time being that they were citizens. If they weren't citizens, he'd have to wait until they were citizens for them to sponsor him. But let's say Enrico's only family in the US are his siblings and they're US citizens, so maybe they can sponsor Enrico. So then our next question becomes, how long will it take? So what you need to know is that for certain of these categories of family sponsorship, there is an annual cap on the number of green cards that can be issued. There's a few exceptions to that. The spouses of a US citizen, children who are under 21 and unmarried, and parents of US citizens, the cap doesn't apply. You never have to wait in a super long line. As soon as you're approved, you can apply for your green card and you can come to the United States. But for everyone else, there's a cap. And that limit, that cap, means that you have to end up waiting in a very long line of backlog, because there's a lot more people that want to come than are able to because of the cap. And that cap applies to children of US citizens who are who are either over 21 or married, siblings of US citizens, and the spouses and children, whether married or unmarried, of green card holders. So in order to figure out, Enrico is going to be subject to one of these caps, right? Because his only family relative in the US is a sibling. So to figure out how long his wait time is going to be, we need to go to the Visa Bulletin, which is a website put out by the Department of State and updated every month. So we can already look at the one for February. And this is a very complicated document. I'm going to scroll down to the part that we're looking for. So these family-sponsored preferences show us the different categories of people that are subject to the caps and the limitations. So it starts with first preference, which is the unmarried sons and daughters of US citizens who are already over 21. Remember, because only under 21 and unmarried get no cap, get to come in right away. So the ones that are, if your child lives abroad and you want to sponsor them, but they're over 21, they'd be subject to a limitation and they'd be considered F1 category. So we go through all the other family memberships, right? We're focused on Enrico. Enrico is actually here in our fourth preference category because he has a brother or a sister who is a US citizen who wants to sponsor him. So now we go down to this chart here and we look at the F4 category for all chargeability areas. So basically China, India, Mexico, and the Philippines have such distinct backlogs that they get their own category, but Enrico's coming from Italy. So let's see what applies to Italy. So right now, green cards are available to people who applied on March 22nd, 2007. This means that if Enrico's brothers sponsored him today, he would be waiting for 15 years before a green card was available to him. If he lived in China, it's the same. If he was Indian, it's 17 years. If he was Mexican, it would be 23 years of waiting. The same horrible backlogs apply to almost all of the other categories. F3 is for the children of US citizens who are married, whether under 21 or over 21. If your child gets married overseas and you want to sponsor them, they're going to be subject to a backlog. It's taking 14 years for all countries, except for Mexico and the Philippines, where it's taking 25 and 20 years respectively. So let's go back to Enrico. Am I going to be able to share my screen again? Okay, I guess this is good enough. All right, so Enrico is looking at a very long wait, essentially, if he wants to go through the family petition process that's available to him, even though he has a relative that qualifies. If he didn't have any brothers here, the family petition process would be totally closed off to him, as well as if his brothers were under 21, or if they were merely green card holders and not yet citizens. It gets even more complicated, because what if Enrico was already in the US without permission? What if he had entered by crossing a land border without authorization and without inspection? Well, one of the things that our 1996 law did is it instituted a penalty for people that enter without inspection or live in the United States with what's called unlawful presence. If you've been here for 6 months to a year and accumulated unlawful presence, there's a 3-year penalty before you can apply for a visa. So you would have to go back to your home country and wait for 3 years before you could come in with a visa. If you've been here for a year or more unlawfully, it's a 10-year penalty. So Enrico would wait for 15 years until his petition was approved, And then he would go back to Italy and wait for 10 more years before he could come in, if he had been here for a year or more unlawfully. This provision of the 1996 law was intended to deter people from coming, because that's what the 1996 law was all about. It was about cracking down and punishing, essentially, immigrants who were coming into the United States without authorization. But in fact, it created powerful incentives to stay, because if you know that you're going to be separated from your family indefinitely, you're not going to leave the United States. It becomes far too risky. And even if you don't buy that correlation, between those two things, clearly the deterrence didn't work, because the 3 to 10 year bar punishment or penalty was created in 1996, and the undocumented population has only steadily risen since then. So clearly folks that are coming to the United States are not going to be deterred by this process, because people really need to come here. All right, so I gave you 4 ways that someone can get a green card in the United States, and we started with family. I mentioned that family is the vast majority of green cards, but this chart really shows you that. The pink and the green bars on each of these charts are all the family green cards that are issued in a given year. The yellow are the employment-based green cards, and the gray are all the others. So you can see that it's really the vast majority of green cards that are available and being issued in a given year are for people in these family categories. Everyone else is just a tiny sliver of the pie. So if Enrico can't come in using a family-based category, his options have gone way down, and his chances of coming in lawfully have gone way down. So number 2 was employment. Employment-based green cards, you saw on that chart, just that tiny little yellow sliver, right? They're only available for people with extraordinary abilities and advanced degrees, and your employer must be willing to sponsor you. So Enrico can't come to the US and apply for one of these on his own. He'd need to have a relationship with an employer who would then sponsor him, go through a long and complicated and expensive process of sponsoring him for a green card. And usually that process involves the employer needing to prove to the US government that they couldn't find a citizen to fill the position. And added on to all of these difficulties, there's just a very tiny number that are authorized per year. So we know that Enrico is 16 years old. He's considered a peasant, which means he has no skills, no job. He's a hard worker, but he's not going to be eligible for an employment-based visa. So then there's the visa lottery. One thing to know about the visa lottery is you can only apply for the visa lottery overseas. It's basically exactly what it sounds like. It's sometimes known as the diversity visa, but it's essentially a lottery that was established in 1990 that provides up to 55,000 immigrant visas each fiscal year for persons from countries with low admissions in the previous 5 years. So basically it's the sense that if the majority of folks that are coming on green cards are coming through the family-based process, we're not going to see a lot of different countries represented. And so, oh, I'm sorry, can you repeat the colors? Let's go back really quick. These colors? These colors are pink and green are the family sponsored. So all the family-based visas are pink and green. Yellow is the employment-based visas, and gray are all of the others. So the vast, vast majority of green cards are being issued in the family categories. And then there's just a teeny tiny number available for employment, and all of the others fall into this gray sliver. So if Enrico can't come through a family-based, by getting a family-based green card, his options are very limited for how he can come. So we've already determined that he can't come via the employment green card pathway. So maybe he can win the visa lottery, right? So this is a lottery that you can only enter abroad. Once you're in the United States, you cannot apply for the visa lottery. And the idea is that it provides these 55,000 green cards per year for countries that aren't well represented in the typical green cards that are being issued in the past over the past 5 years. So Africa, these 55,000 get distributed up among the different countries. So Africa this year, as of January 2022, had been issued 13,500. All of Asia got 6,000. Europe got 10,000. North America, which includes Mexico, got 6. Australia got 650, and all of South America, including Central America, got 900. So when you break down the numbers like that and you consider the number of people that want to come into the United States, particularly the sheer number of refugees in the world that are seeking safety, there's 11 million new refugees in the world as of 2021. 55,000 is not that many at all, particularly if you're up against, you're only eligible for up to 13,500 of those, and because you're living anywhere in the African continent. So winning the visa lottery is really much like winning any other lottery. Your odds are really low. So Enrico could try his luck and put in for the visa lottery and see if his name ever gets called. And finally, Enrico's fourth option. His fourth and final option is the humanitarian pathways. So humanitarian options for a green card, they were that little gray sliver, which also included the diversity visa lottery. There's a lot of different types that are incorporated under the humanitarian options for a green card, but they all have very specific requirements. I've just put some of them up here. So one of those is refugees and asylum seekers. The requirement for a green card that way is you need to prove that you're fleeing persecution in your home country. The only difference between refugees and asylees is that a refugee applies overseas in their country to come to the US and comes with their green card, and an asylum seeker comes into the United States and then applies. But both of them have to meet the same legal definition. So other than refugees, everyone else on this list, you can only apply in the United States. So to qualify, Enrico would have to get into the United States first, and then try his luck applying for asylum, which has become extremely difficult. He's a child, so he may be eligible for special immigrant juvenile status, which is available to abused, abandoned, and neglected children. Technically, anyone under 21 can qualify, but in practice, it ends up being 18 in most states. Not New Jersey, though. New Jersey, you can be 21. And if people have more questions, I can talk more. There's the Violence Against Women Act, which allows the abused spouses or children of US citizens or green card holders to basically bypass the normal family petition process if they can prove that there's abuse by the person that should be sponsoring them. There's the U visa for victims of very violent crimes here in the US, and there's the T visa for victims of human trafficking here in the US. So based on what we know about Enrico, he's trying to come into the country. Meeting the bar for being a refugee is extremely difficult. The US only recognizes very limited and specific populations as even qualifying for refugee status. And it's a really long, complicated, often years-long process to be designated as a refugee and then accepted into the United States from abroad. He'd have to already be here to apply for asylum or special immigrant juvenile status. He's not married, his parents are deceased, so VAWA probably isn't gonna work. If he came and lived in the United States as an undocumented person, maybe he'd be the victim of a horrible crime and then he could apply for a U visa or a T visa, but we don't want that for Enrico. And of course, that's not really a way to come in, right? That's just more of a, of a Band-Aid we're using to help folks that are victims of horrible crimes. So with all of that being said, what are Enrico's options today? We said that in 1903, he had no problem coming right in. But today in 2022, his options are much more limited. I mean, maybe he could apply for a family-based green card, but he'd be waiting 15 years before he was able to even start. And that would have a couple big ifs attached to it. If his brother is a US citizen and willing to petition for him, and if Enrico is outside the US, or if he entered lawfully and has maintained his lawful status during that entire 15-year waiting period, maybe by constantly renewing a student visa, but it'd be pretty hard to keep renewing your student visa for 15 years. He'd probably need to go back to Italy for a while before he'd be able to come in. So family's a difficult option, but probably his only legal option at this point. Employment is straight out. The visa lottery, super unlikely. He could spend decades of his life waiting to see if he wins one of 10,000 visas that are allocated to his country or his continent. And then there's the humanitarian pathways. I mean, so first, perhaps if he entered as an unaccompanied minor, as an alien child, which I said earlier, he would have been if he had entered alone at age 16. Maybe he could apply for special immigrant juvenile status if he could prove that he had suffered abuse, abandonment, or neglect in his country. He'd definitely need a lawyer for that process, and I don't know if Enrico can afford one. For asylum, similarly, it's become extremely difficult. He'd need to prove that he was specifically targeted because of his race, ethnicity, political opinion, membership in a particular social group. Asylum cases, you're 5 times more likely to win if you have a lawyer, simply because the law is so complicated in this area. He only has $12 and he's 16, so his chances of getting a lawyer are pretty difficult. So, today in 2022, it's very unclear if Enrico would have been able to come in legally. And so then, Enrico enters the US at age 16 in 1903. He started a grocery business in Southwest Philadelphia. His son, my grandfather, was born in 1925. He served in World War II. He graduated from medical school. He delivered thousands of babies. I mean, Enrico was able to see his American dream through, right? And a big part of that was because he entered this country without the chains around him of not having the ability to legally work, being constantly afraid of deportation. Today, that story doesn't look the same. The one option is, so maybe how the story goes is Enrico Matera's US citizen brother do file a family petition for them. So then he spends the next 15 years in Italy waiting for a visa to become available to him. And during this time, he needs to survive as an orphan who's considered a peasant while caring for his 14-year-old sister in Italy, which was suffering from extreme poverty and violent political upheaval at this time. So 15 years, I don't think Enrico has it. But if he manages to survive all that time of waiting, he could enter the US at age 32 and start a new life. Or Enrico could enter the US without papers and live out his life as an undocumented person. Perhaps his son Al would be born in the US as a US citizen, but he would grow up with this anxiety, right? That his father is undocumented and maybe he would never have the opportunity to go to medical school because his family wasn't able to accumulate as much wealth because his father was forced to work jobs under the table, right? It's a kind of a ripple effect. Or as an alternate ending, maybe by some miracle, he enters the US without papers, finds a pro bono lawyer who then helps him apply for SIJS or special immigrant juvenile status and asylum. He goes through a long and traumatizing years-long court process trying to apply for one of these forms of relief where he's forced to testify on the stand repeatedly about the worst things that have ever happened to him. And then he gets his green card and he's able to start his new life. And so I think it's important for people who look like me, because people who are immigrants today, they already know this story, but it's important for people who look like me and can trace our history back to Enrico Matera and 1903 or 1850, folks fleeing the potato famine, for us to understand how different our experience was from people that are coming today, how different it was for the Irish and the Italian and the Russians, and how different it is by contrast today. The reasons for pursuing the American dream haven't changed, but the countries that are sending folks have, and the laws certainly has. So that's my immigration then and now spiel. And so with the time remaining, oh gosh, that took us all the way to 8 o'clock. I think this meeting goes to 8:30. So I was gonna do like 15 minutes on current events in immigration, and then like 15 minutes of Q&A. Does that still sound like a good plan? Or did people have questions based on immigration then and now? All right, so yeah, Sister Claire.
It sounds like a good plan. 15 minutes current, and then.
Great. All right, so I just selected a few that have been on my mind recently, and I'm gonna keep sharing my screen, so hopefully everybody can see that. All right, so first, Migrant Protection Protocols 2.0, also known as the Remain in Mexico policy. Second, we're going to talk a little bit about the expulsions of Haitians that have been happening at the southern border. and then a little bit about Afghan refugees, SIVs, which stands for Special Immigrant Visa, and parolees. Just a few sort of recent happenings in immigration law, and then of course during the Q&A, feel free to ask me anything, and I can't promise I'll answer. But so the migrant protection protocols, this has been a pretty confusing story, and so that's why I wanted to talk about it. I call it 2.0 because this is the second version of it that we now are living with. So the migrant protection protocols is basically a policy that requires asylum seekers who are arriving at the US-Mexico border to wait in Mexico during the processing of their asylum claim. So US law recognizes the right of somebody who is fleeing for their life, fleeing from persecution in their home country, to come present themselves at the border and request asylum. And usually what happens is that person gets placed into a court process, and they must prove in court before the immigration judge that they qualify for asylum. And if they qualify, they get to stay. So there is nothing illegal about coming to the US-Mexico border and requesting asylum. In fact, it's enshrined in our law. And under our international obligations, we're not supposed to send anyone back to a country where they could face persecution until we give them a hearing on their asylum case. But in 2019, under the Trump administration, we found a workaround, right? Or the Trump administration found a little workaround to that, where folks that are arriving at the US-Mexico border, instead of being allowed in, basically paroled into the country temporarily to fight their asylum case and request asylum in court, are being halted at the border and told to wait in Mexico. These are not people from Mexico. They don't technically have a right to be in Mexico, except that the US negotiated a deal with Mexico. They don't have homes or families in the United States. The vast majority are from the Northern Triangle countries of Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. They face horrific human rights abuses on the Mexican side of the border, simply because they're living in tents. They're essentially homeless. They're kind of in legal limbo, right? They're far from home, and they thought they were going to be able to apply for asylum. They're in many cases fleeing for their lives from Central America, or at the very least fleeing really brutal poverty. And so since 2019 in January, 70,000 people were affected by this policy and sent back to Mexico. The Biden administration, it was one of the first things that they did in office was to terminate that program. That termination led to a lot of chaos at the border. It was like people didn't really know what was happening, and the border officials were doing different things in different cases, but at least we weren't actively sending asylum seekers back to limbo on the Mexican border to live in parks and under bridges and be victims of kidnapping and other horrible crimes while they waited to apply for asylum, a process that takes many, many years. But then in August 2021, a federal court ordered the Biden administration to reinstate Remain in Mexico. And they had several months to do it. And many advocates would say they had several ways to do it. But instead, they chose to reinstate the program exactly as it looked like under Trump. And that went back into effect on December 3rd, and the administration started again sending asylum seekers back to Mexico on December 6th, 2021. It's been an absolute disaster, a huge rife with human rights abuses, not to mention really chaotic processing of the cases on the US side. So basically, you present yourself, you might get through, and then Border Patrol would, detain you. You'd be given a hearing date and then literally sent on a bus and dropped off on the Mexican side of the border and told to wait, right? And then you just have to try to figure out how to survive until you get back in line, get back on the bus, and get driven often to courts that might be housed in a tent or temporary courts, and then you get sent back. And meanwhile, you have no access to legal counsel, very little access to other resources that could help you prepare your case. So it's really been a disaster, and it's really quite disturbing that it's gone back into effect and will keep affecting other asylum seekers. So maybe the best way to do this is, if there's any specific questions about the Migrant Protection Protocols 2.0, I'm happy to take them now if folks either want to go off mute or type a question into the chat box. I often hear from folks, what should we be doing? What should we be doing? I think it's important to know the current policies. And so then we know specifically what to lobby for. And it's very confusing what's happened with the migrant protection protocols. The Biden administration says they had no choice. They had to reinstate it because of the court order. But most immigration advocacy agencies agree that there was a better way to do it than just going right back to where we were back in 2020 and 2019. All right, so I'm going to keep moving then. So the next current event that I wanted to talk about is one that I really don't think has been getting enough attention in the media. And this is a massive number of expulsions, deportations that have been happening of Haitians, asylum seekers on our southern border. So in late summer and September of 2021, thousands of Haitians began arriving at the southern border seeking asylum, seeking entry to the US. About 2/3 of them were estimated to be family groups. As of today, the US has deported over 15,000 Haitians, including many children, on flights right from Texas back to Haiti. Many more have been admitted back into the United States, but huge numbers have been deported on flights that have just continuously been happening from September all the way through December. These are, in many cases, folks who fled Haiti for other countries in Central and South America, mostly South America, because of really difficult conditions in Haiti, and then made the long journey all the way through South America to the southern border, hoping that they would be admitted to the United States, only to have that journey ended by being sent back to Haiti. And what makes this decision by the US government particularly unconscionable is that conditions in Haiti have reached an all-time low. Their president was assassinated in July of 2021, and his assassination has left basically no functioning government in its place. Not only that, within a month of that assassination, they suffered a major earthquake, and then 2 days later, a tropical storm, which absolutely ravaged the country, which has still not recovered from a 2010 earthquake. And so in addition to sort of brutal poverty, there is also now gang rule in most parts of the country, widespread kidnapping. And the main way that this has hit the news has been through the kidnapping of several Christian missionaries that occurred this fall. But the reality is that Haitians all over the country have been subjected to horrible kidnappings and violence. And it's a really, it's just a brutal situation to be deporting folks back to a country that is really not capable of receiving them at this time. So that's another piece of really bad news, and I'm sorry to be raising it, but it's frustrating to me that this particular story hasn't remained in the news. It was there in September, and then we kind of moved on to other things, but the deportations have continued of Haitians, and the conditions in Haiti really have grown to be very dire. Any questions specifically about Haitian expulsions at the southern border? I'm doing so much talking. All right, last current event. Folks, I think, have been following the news about Afghan refugees and asylees. So when the US pulled out of Afghanistan, and this is part of the reason I think that the Haitian story hasn't gotten as much play in the media, because it happened right around the same time as the really chaotic withdrawal of American forces from Afghanistan. So the plan had always been for US troops to have a gradual withdrawal and to institute a refugee processing program in Afghanistan that would allow for people to come into the US fully as refugees, which means a green card. That process, though, takes a ton of time, and nobody seems to have expected that this would become so chaotic and so quick, that the American withdrawal would happen almost instantly, and that the Taliban would immediately take over the country and overthrow the Afghan government within a matter of weeks instead of within a matter of months. So many folks, so that refugee resettlement project just never happened in Afghanistan. Many were able to be evacuated from the country. Those that were tended to have really close ties to the US government. So yeah, I'm seeing some questions and it's distracting me. I'll get through this slide and then I'm gonna jump into all the questions. Okay, so those who were able to be evacuated out of Afghanistan typically are either special immigrant visa holders or humanitarian parolees. So special immigrant visa is a special visa for those who worked with the US military or US government agencies as translators or as other workers. They're at particularly high risk of reprisal from the Taliban because they're essentially part of the US military and government. And so this SIV status is particularly for them. But it's very rare to be given that status. You have to have a pretty, obvious and strong connection to the US government. It leaves out a lot of other people who are still really at risk. People like police officers for the Afghan military or the Afghan security forces. Anybody with a connection to the Afghan government doesn't they wouldn't qualify for an SIV. And neither would things like female school teachers who are now facing Taliban reprisals, under the new order imposed by the Taliban. Humanitarian parole is kind of then what these other folks might be eligible for. So humanitarian parole is a temporary admission for 2 years, and you're allowed to have work authorization during those 2 years. So everything happens so quickly that refugee status, green cards are straight out. But what we do have are the folks that were evacuated are either SIVs or humanitarian parolees. So a lot of folks are still on military bases, but over time, most have already now been processed out into the community. They have their work permits as either parolees or SIVs. So now we continue. So in the meantime, many Afghans living in the US are desperate to get their family members out of Afghanistan, but they're not left with many options. They've got the family petition process, all the processes that we just mentioned, right? The visa lottery, the employment-based visas, the humanitarian pathway really for someone living in Afghanistan would just be a refugee, but there's no functioning refugee program in Afghanistan right now. So really family members here in the US who want to get their family out of Afghanistan are left family petitioning for them with that long, long backlog for so many family members, or humanitarian parole. So just get them out, right? Get them into the United States, and then we can take it from there. Since humanitarian parole is just for 2 years, but immigration announced recently that it's a really high burden of evidence that people need to prove to win a humanitarian parole case. So really unclear just how much someone's going to need to prove to even be able to get out of Afghanistan. And even then, they'd need to travel outside of Afghanistan to a neighboring country to finish processing their humanitarian parole application. So you'd need to travel out of Afghanistan to Iran or Turkey or another neighboring country in order to process that application and get out of Afghanistan and into the United States. So that's sort of one side of the problem, is all the people that couldn't get out and their family members here in the US who want to get them out and don't really have a way to bring them into the US legally because it's so hard to come into the US legally. Then there's the other problem of the humanitarian parolees who are already here, who will need to apply for something because their humanitarian parole will expire in 2 years. Their work permits will expire if they can't show that they are in the process of applying for asylum or have a family member who's petitioning for them. So there's a really high need right now for pro bono lawyers who are able to take on these asylum cases. And I think it's still a really open question how lenient immigration judges will be with these Afghan cases, because general asylum has been extremely difficult to win in recent years. All right, so let me quickly just ask if there are any questions about the Afghan situation before I move on to some of the other questions in the chat. Okay. All right. So I'm just going to jump into the chat. Any questions about anything we've talked about at any time, please feel free to ask. Let me pull up the chat on the screen. All right, so is there a reason for not accepting the Haitians? Yeah, Sarita, that's a great question. I think it's part of a general campaign at the border to deport folks that don't appear eligible for asylum. So if you don't if you don't sort of pass an initial screening for asylum, anyone who arrives at the US border undocumented and is detained will be deported. The only exception to that is for people that pass what's called a credible fear interview. And then, okay, they can continue to the next steps of the asylum process because they've shown they have a credible fear of returning. But the problem we've seen with the big issue is that you see how there's no way to come into the US legally, right? Unless you have a family member and you've got a family petition, pretty much everyone else is left just trying their luck with asylum at the southern border. But these are folks, you know, that may not be fleeing a life-threatening threat, or they're fleeing general violence, what's known as generalized violence, right? So the gangs are really dangerous in my town. Well, the way the immigration law has come down, it doesn't meet that need, because the asylum law says you need to show a specific threat because of who you are. So general violence or generalized gang violence isn't enough. And economic necessity has never been a basis for asylum. And so asylum really doesn't meet the need of immigrants that are coming to the southern border, whether that be from the Northern Triangle or whether it be from Haiti. So if Haitian, you know, my understanding, I don't know quite enough about the Haitian situation exactly to know, but my guess is that the deportations are because the Haitians can't establish a credible fear in their country. It may sometimes be because they've triggered some kind of security threat of some kind. You know, those would be really the main reasons why somebody would be deported rather than given a chance to apply for asylum. The asylum system just really doesn't meet the need of people that are trying to come here, right, to find a better life, who are fleeing for economic reasons, especially. Charlene writes that Faith in New Jersey is part of a national letter to President Biden that will be released tomorrow in support of Haitian immigrants. Yay, that's great. Everybody sign on if it's not too late. Nellie asks, what is the reason to deport Haitians? Yeah, you know, same reason. I think that it's a combination of folks just not meeting the standard for asylum at the southern border. What special interests are most involved with and benefit most by limiting and restricting immigration? Yolanda, that is a question for the ages. I think that immigration restriction, I think that the history of the immigration laws that I showed you often seems like the laws that we pass are much more responsive to anxiety about the numbers of people coming in, you know, too many people coming in, too many people of this nationality coming in. They're more responsive to that kind of anxiety than they are about actual economic realities. And so people get anxious that foreign workers are taking American jobs. They get anxious that too many foreigners are coming into the United States and somehow changing America, which is ridiculous because, as you saw on that graph, America is literally constantly changing. So I think the special interests that are helped are literally any politician that can make a stance based on seizing on that kind of anxiety. And then there's also a really big economic interest in the fact that immigrant labor is essentially happening under the table with much fewer rights, with less ability to bargain collectively, less ability to organize, even though organizing and collective bargaining are possible for undocumented people. But undocumented workers are just at a far greater disadvantage. And I think that benefits employers and US financial interests. Are Venezuelans an exception? Oh, such a good question about Venezuelans. I think Venezuela probably needs an entire presentation. I think that, so an exception, I'm not sure exactly what you mean by exception, but what I will say is that I didn't talk about TPS, or temporary protected status, which is available right now to Venezuelans and actually to Haitians too. TPS is the US government can declare that a country is too dangerous to deport somebody to. And so they're going to let people from that country who can meet a few requirements basically stay on in the United States and get a work permit. It's similar to DACA. It's like, we know you're here, but we're not going to deport you. We're going to protect you for the time being, and you can work legally. But one day TPS is going to end, and then you're going to have to go back, right? So TPS is temporary. So Venezuelans, that is something they can apply for, but the catch is you have to already be here in the US. So a Venezuelan arriving at the southern border would have to pass a credible fear interview, show that they basically might qualify for asylum in order to get in, or maybe they come in because Venezuela is much further in South America. So Venezuelans might arrive on a tourist visa and then overstay because it's too dangerous to go back. And then they could apply for TPS. My tourist visa expired, but I can't go back to Venezuela because, the economy has collapsed. And so that person could also apply for TPS. So that is one exception that exists, but it's not permanent, right? It's not a green card, and it's not a pathway to a green card either. I think some of the immigration legislation that has been proposed has been to provide a pathway out of DACA, out of TPS to a green card, basically creating a fifth path, right? So you don't have to meet one of those 4 ways to get a green card, but just by having TPS and meeting, paying a fine and showing some other requirements like that you have a clean criminal record, those people would have a pathway into a green card. But that legislation has not managed to pass. Haitian immigrants have a history of being targeted by the US government that can be traced by gaining their freedom. Absolutely. I mean, Charlene, it's a great point. And I think the ambassador to Haiti that retired or resigned in protest in September based on the Haitian expulsions and the US handling of that has written some really interesting things about the history of US policy in Haiti, going all the way back to when enslaved people revolted in Haiti, took back control of their own government, and were immediately hit with trade sanctions and embargoes that crippled their economy. And so the history of US relations with Haiti has been really, has really strongly hurt the country's ability to become independent. And there's could be a whole thing written just on the response to the Haitian earthquake and how that recovery has been, maybe not that US interests haven't really assisted in that recovery in the best way possible. So it's a really difficult history, and it's just really unfortunate because there is another path away from those deportations. I just really think that parole or TPS for those folks would have been a better option. Carol O'Neill says there was a need for more immigration personnel, such as judges, lawyers, et cetera, prior to the pandemic. Do you feel the pandemic has exacerbated this, and do you see any improvement in this area in the future? That's a good question. The pandemic has been weird and difficult. I think that there has been a need for immigration judges for a long time. I'm not sure if the pandemic necessarily created a particular strain other than that was already there on the need to fill immigration judge seats and also fill them just not merely with former ICE prosecutors, right? That was something we saw under the Trump administration, where there were many, many new immigration judges appointed, and the vast majority had a background in being ICE prosecutors rather than defense side immigration lawyers. More pro bono assistance is definitely needed on immigration cases, and I do think that the pandemic has hurt the ability of lawyers to provide as many pro bono services as is needed, because lawyers are strapped for resources. Immigration lawyers might not have as much resource to take on a pro bono case as they might have in the past. I definitely do think that there's a need for pro bono lawyers. I also think probably the biggest thing that the pandemic has done is it's just really worn everyone out. So there's a lot of burnout that I've noticed and felt among immigration lawyers, because it was kind of the 1-2 punch of the Trump administration and then the pandemic, because it was really difficult. I mean, I started in 2019. I haven't been in this game for very long. But immigration lawyers that were lawyers throughout the entire presidency had to deal with just this constant chaos of changing regulations, really, I don't know what the right word is, just policies that seemed constantly aimed at just making life more difficult, not even like particularly useful. Like, for example, in 2017, or no, it was more like 2019, I was already practicing, and we started getting our applications for U visas rejected. And U visas are some of the most sympathetic applications you can send to immigration. It's for people that were victims of violent crimes, and ours are all for victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, really horrible crimes. And they just started getting sent back to us. And it was because if anyone's ever seen an immigration application, they're like 15 pages long, and they've got tons of questions in little fields. And many of the fields won't apply. For example, if you don't have a middle name, you just leave that box blank. Well, we started getting these applications rejected and sent back to us because we hadn't written NA, not applicable, in every little box. and the policy just went into effect overnight. And it just caused confusion, you know, and it's like, well, this just makes life harder on immigrants and on lawyers. And what's the real purpose here? Why are we even doing this? And so that kind of stuff was just constant throughout the Trump administration. And then just as it's ending, you get hit with the pandemic, and that's caused so many delays in processing. It's been extremely frustrating for clients and really frustrating for like everyone involved. The immigration courts really weren't equipped for the technological shift that needed to happen with the pandemic. So that's just been really, I think, a source more of burnout among folks working in the field than anything else. So good question. I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. You know, at this point, please do feel free to either take yourself off mute and jump in, or, oh shoot, did I miss one? Somebody said something on this chat. I think you asked, my computer's being a little difficult. Are there still camps of children who were separated from their parents at the border? That's a good question. That was a really horrible time, a really dark moment in US immigration history. So there are no longer any camps of children who are separated from their parents. Those camps were pretty short-lived because many of the children that were separated were sent to foster care facilities and shelters. So there's many children in foster care and in shelters across the US. But a much smaller number are specifically children that were separated from their families. I think, I haven't looked at this recently, but at least as of a year ago, there were still several hundred children who had been separated from parents, and the parents were deported. And so groups like Amnesty International were trying to literally send people to countries in the Northern Triangle and try to locate the parents so that they could reunite them with their child. As far as I know, though, that had trickled down to maybe more like a few dozen children and families. And I do think that efforts are being made to reconnect those folks. So it's probably more of a problem of dozens than it is of hundreds at this point. But yeah, that was a really dark moment. Have I gotten everybody's question, whether you sent it to the whole group or to me individually? All right, well, I think the meeting still has a couple more things on your agenda, so I'm gonna stop sharing if I can figure that out. Yeah, and just thank you so much again for inviting me and letting me speak to you all. I hope it was helpful. The presentation, Immigration Then and Now, I designed it with a really specific audience in mind. I'm not sure, you all might know already too much about immigration for that presentation, but I hope it was useful. And thanks so much for inviting me.
It was fantastic. I wondered if you have any champions that you in our government right now that you would highlight for us that we can reach out to.
Champions in government that you can reach out to? Is that what?
I mean, that we can support, that we can get behind, that we can, I don't know. What
That's
can
a
we
great
do?
question.
What can we do?
I know this is always the part where I struggle. I think that, well, okay, so the first answer is vote. Vote in your local elections at every level of government. Make sure that you vote. Ask the people that you're voting for their stance on immigration. I can't give specific names right now, but I would say it's usually pretty easy to figure out where someone stands on immigration and use your vote. Otherwise, I think that there's a real need right now to support pro bono legal services for immigrants, particularly those who are in removal proceedings. And there's a lot of ways that you can do that. You can volunteer at legal aid organizations. You can donate funds to organizations that are providing pro bono legal services. If you're a lawyer, you should learn how to do an asylum case and take one on. So I would say support local organizations that are providing representation to immigrants, and organizations that are providing court accompaniment to immigrants, although that has become really difficult in the pandemic. I do see the courts opening again in the next 4 to 6 months. And so court accompaniment is something that can be really helpful. Yeah, I think that's great. I think one thing that I'm particularly interested also is in bond funds for immigrants and immigration bond and immigration detention, because immigration detention, in order to get out, you have to pay the full amount of the bond. There's no, unlike criminal court, you can't pay it in graduated amounts. And so people need to come up with a $1,500 bond in its entirety. They can't pay 10%. And so I think I'm very interested in bond funds, and I know of a couple in Pennsylvania, but in New Jersey, I'm not sure. So I think that that's where I see a lot of need right now.